this podcast, you'll find interviews with high-performing, successful individuals in life sciences. On a weekly basis, we cover their proven methods, principles, strategies, and mindsets to implement new technologies that scale to meet the needs of people in our world.
Welcome to this episode of Life Science Success. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Don, and I'm a digital marketer in life sciences. And today on the podcast, my guest is Jonathan Usuka. Jonathan is a seasoned pharmaceutical industry executive with over 25 years of experience in both scientific and business leadership roles. So, Jonathan, welcome to the podcast. Good to have you here.
Yeah, Don, thanks very much for having me on. It's really exciting.
Thanks a lot. And would you mind just maybe tell listeners just a little bit about yourself and what led you to want to be in the pharmaceutical industry?
Sure. I mean, it's a great question. I'm motivated by the ability to see data and data that people have not seen before. That's what I find really exciting. So in graduate school in Stanford in sort of the mid to late 90s, the Human Genome Project was just taking off. There were a lot of careers in science, but then also a lot of innovative companies and transformative therapeutics that were coming out of the fact that we could get at data that was fundamentally inaccessible previously. And so the genomics technologies that were enabling us to look directly at DNA sequencing and then analyze that data, I just found that incredibly exciting. I knew that there would be a lifetime of work in that field. And I also knew that it was a transition point for the industry, but also just our fundamental understanding of what it means to be human, really, to be able to understand what was going on in DNA. So I got excited about that. There were a lot of opportunities at the time my focus was bioinformatics. I was doing computational chemistry at Stanford when this data explosion happened. And so it was, reasonably straightforward to switch into bioinformatics at that time. And I think it was just a great decision. So that led to a career in the pharmaceutical industry, both as a researcher and as a corporate leader. Now it's been going on, I guess, since that time, whatever that is, since the mid 90s, 20 years, 30 years, I guess.
Yeah, I find it interesting because I guess from a couple of different points, right? One is, I don't think we would have the diagnostics that we have or the pharmaceuticals that we have today without a lot of the capabilities that we have to filter and focus the data that we get. And then secondly, the tools must have changed as well throughout, your journey in the 20 plus years as well. I would imagine that they're a lot better now, but I mean, that's just a guess on my part.
Yeah. And so some of the things have changed in terms of tools and the kinds of data that we can see. I was just talking about the genomics data, DNA or mRNA, sort of the genomics and transcriptomics. I think what has really changed and is starting to accelerate is our ability to go beyond the genome and look at things like proteomics and metabolomics. We'll talk more about those kinds of things. What has really happened in the pharmaceutical industry over these last couple decades is the advent of personalized medicine. What that has meant for a couple therapy areas, things like oncology that cancer used to be defined by what organ or where the cancer occurred, lung cancer, prostate cancer, et cetera. And to some extent it still is, but now it's very much defined by the biomarkers of the mutations of that cancer. That's very much the therapeutics approach. So we've gone from things like oncology where you were treating a larger organ and, with a single approach to just a range of different therapeutic tools. It's made every cancer unique, every patient situation unique, and it's kind of transformed oncology into something that's much more like rare disease. And then a big thing that's happened since then is the recognition that there are a lot of rare diseases out there now that we can tackle using that toolkit from oncology. So I think the kinds of data, genomics, transcriptomics, moving into other areas, the availability of real world data, patient response to therapy, and then this atomization of therapy areas and indications into sub-indications and rare subtypes. It's been really exciting to watch over these decades.
Yeah, I really also want to try and touch on your career overall. So throughout your overall career in both business and scientific leadership roles, what do you think some of the key milestones of your career have been?
That's a great question. I mean, I think that there are probably two big parts to my career. One was around the science of understanding disease. That has a lot to do with some of the data and the analysis of that data and then applying it to a pharmaceutical context. And then the next big phase for me was the move into private equity and really getting into companies that are pre-IPO or backed by private investors, and really taking those companies forward in terms of how we understand disease or develop therapeutics. So my early science career was all about bioinformatics and genomics. At Stanford, our lab, and I was lead author of a article that made it to the cover of Science. That was the result of a small company that I was leading that got acquired by Roche, and that's how I started at Roche. And so there at Roche and at Genentech, I was really learning how IP becomes a medicine. I started to really view pharmaceutical companies much more like information companies, how the therapeutics that you develop are hitting a pharmaceutical target, usually a protein, understanding that protein in the context of disease, and then understanding how that therapeutic interacts with the disease in very particular patients. And so the recruitment of clinical trials, the design of clinical trials. And from there, I moved into Celgene. And that part of my career was much more enterprise-wide and much more IT focused, really supporting the entire enterprise in how they use data, primarily around expanding, one very good, I think, life-changing therapy, Revlimid, and understanding which patient populations would benefit from that therapeutic. So that's kind of the first half of my career that was all around the science of understanding disease. From there, I moved into much more private equity. I started with McKinsey Company, which is a global management consulting firm. There I learned a lot about talent management, sort of the higher level or board level communications, thinking deeply about how you recommend something and a completeness around recommendations. And from there, I got into supporting due diligence and investors directly. I left McKinsey to join one of my clients at McKinsey, which was Konica Minolta. And there we drove some solutions in integrated diagnostics. And those companies, recently acquired by Tempus and by CapVest. So it's been a really interesting journey from understanding disease, developing therapeutics to treat those diseases, and then supporting investors in different vehicles to monetize and commercialize those therapeutics or the understanding of that disease.
Yeah. So, and throughout your different transitions, what were some of the more significant challenges that you faced and had to consider as you were, considering different roles?
Yeah. There have been a number of challenges. One is, first of all companies in all situations are different. So Roche was a global pharmaceutical company. There were a number of different interactions that you had to drive a therapeutic forward. At Celgene, we were very much focused on a single product, but we were broadening the portfolio really around immuno-oncology and different ways to treat patients with, very similar types of cancer in terms of the biomarkers, but very different in terms of the presentation of that cancer. And then I think another big thing, a challenge that I've faced is in terms of team management, really having the courage to make changes when the team is not right. You know, helping those people who belong on the team and really have contributions, figuring out what those contributions are, helping them to define that, and then also bringing in new people that change up the team dynamic. And that's always a challenging situation.
Yeah, definitely a lot always to consider and manage as well. Um, and I also would say that I get the sense that the difference though between a large company and a small company, and the pace that you can move, to be able to make those changes is vastly different as well.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And I think there is something to the small company. There's also a lot to be said for keeping teams small and very focused on challenges. Um, and then there's a lot to be put into goal setting, both in organization goals, but also personal and individual goals. And so those are some of the things that translate between big companies and small companies, or large organizations and small organizations.
Yeah, absolutely. So, can you describe your current role in the mission of Sapient, and particularly focus on the integration of AI and pharmaceutical services?
Sure. So, Sapient is a really innovative small company. And what we're doing is we're bringing the pharmaceutical industry and drug researchers beyond the genome. I think there has been a tremendous impact from genomics. And just very quickly, I throw around a lot of words like genomics, transcriptomics, proteomics, et cetera. Let me quickly define those. So a lot of people know about what's called the central dogma of biology. That's where DNA gets made into mRNA or messenger RNA, and then that then gets translated into a protein. The protein is what does essentially everything in the body or in the cell. That's what catalyzes the reactions. That's the molecular machinery that actually makes life special. That's also where disease occurs. And those proteins are the targets for pharmaceuticals. So when you hear about drug targets, we're talking about proteins. Those reactions in the body that are catalyzed by protein, the results of those show up in terms of different analytes, either in the blood or within the cell, and often called metabolites or other things that you can detect. And so, what's really interesting, I think, about the industry and where we play at Sapient is we've long had good tools for looking at genomics and transcriptomics, those things that get translated into a protein. But only recently have we had good tools to look directly at proteins or the results of those changes in the body, like the metabolites. And so Sapient very much focuses on that universe where multi-omics comes together: genomics, transcriptomics, and especially proteomics and metabolomics. So that enables you to look more deeply at drug targets. It enables you to better understand personalized therapies. And then, very specifically, it helps you to understand how the patient is responding to the therapy.
Yeah, and I think it's very very important to one understand kind of that base, and then also more specifically where Sapient does play. How does Sapient's approach to integrated diagnostics and AI driven solutions differentiate from other players though in the industry?
Yeah, so there are a couple of things that are really broad industrial trends that we're taking advantage of. And so there is an aspect of being in the right place at the right time. There have been a revolution from AI in data interpretation, but also really some new engineering of instrumentation and just lab automation. So we use, our weapon of choice is mass spectrometry. It's a technology that's been around for like a really long time, like since probably 1950s, 1960s, 1970s. But it's always been a very bespoke, artisanal kind of low throughput detection. So it's very accurate in terms of what it can see, but it's always been very slow and it's not been able to scale up for the kinds of broad-based pharmaceutical research that's really needed in the current industrial context. So what has changed with mass spec? And there really been a couple things. There's the lab automation, increased instrumentation, but what was really laborious now and what we've, I think, have solved at Sapient is the data interpretation. So that time from data generation from an instrument to interpretation and the ability to guide a pharmaceutical R&D program, we've reduced that cycle time tremendously. So from where it was months, now we're at a couple hours, which means that our throughput has increased exponentially. We can look at thousands of samples simultaneously, and we can look at thousands of proteins within those samples. And so it really changes the fundamental nature, the kinds of questions that a pharmaceutical company can answer.
Very good. And what are some of the most innovative projects that you're currently working on, and how do they align to the company's overall goals?
Yeah, so we put together a real world data set. It's called Dynamic. And what Dynamic is a very deep look at about 10, 15,000 patients. So in terms of real world data sets, when you look at like prescriber information or pharmacy information, or even electronic medical records, having 10,000 patients is not that much. A lot of these, especially the transactions data associated with prescriber habits and what medicines are prescribed by which doctors. Those are data sets of millions of patients. What makes our data set in Dynamic very unique, though, is that we've deeply characterized these 10,000 patients across multiple time points so you can see disease evolution. And the lab characterization that we've done of those patients is to look very deeply at their protein profile and their metabolite profile. So you can see the onset of disease at a molecular level. You can see the treatment of that disease at a molecular level. And then you can see the evolution, the response to therapy over time. So although it's not a large number of patients, again, it's only 10,000 patients, but we've characterized those patients in a pretty extensive data cube, 10,000 patients by 10,000 proteins by 10,000 metabolites over like 10 different time points. So again, you can see things in this data set that are actually fairly unique and help guide pharmaceutical, trial design, but also where new drug targets could come from.
That was going to be my next question. Does it also help with targeting as well? So, you helped to answer that, but it seems to me like a very important data point to know.
Yeah, the whole game is the right therapy in the right patient, in the right dose, at a time where the therapy will cause a response in the disease state. And so, the arsenal of therapies that we have to treat disease is ever expanding. But, the really key point around it is once a therapy is approved, there are a lot of different uses for that therapy beyond the label. And so a lot of the new uses come from existing pharmaceuticals where you develop an understanding of how that therapeutic works in the body and how it targets other diseases. So a lot of the things that we're doing with AI really help us to understand how the drug is actually working, which patients will benefit, and then how you might modulate dose so that you get that maximum patient benefit. A lot of what's important in pharmaceuticals is that efficacious response from the patient, but then also maintaining the safety of the patient so that there isn't an adverse event or that you don't hit that significant dose where you get toxicity.
Well, I mean, that's a great lead into my next question as well. So, can you provide an example of a successful project where um, your tools or AI were used to advance a therapeutic pipeline or improve patient outcome?
Yeah. So what we do is we characterize samples deeply, as I described, using mass spec, developing unbiased data sets at scale. So pharmaceutical companies trust us with their samples, clinical trial samples. They also trust us with how those patients responded or how they're progressing in a clinical trial. We then can characterize those patient samples to find out what is going on that's different among responders or non-responders or patients that have a safety event and those that don't. So we can do that kind of grouping, but a lot of people can do that. What we also do is put it together with our dynamic data set. And that enables us to identify very specific biomarkers that are going to help predict patient response. So one example was a pharmaceutical company that we worked with through our analysis, but then the use of our data set, we were able to help them to understand that they should modify the trial protocol and really rescue a drug that was having some difficulties in phase 2A. And so where the trial would have been a failure, by our intervention and understanding exactly which patients would or would not respond to the therapy and getting that biomarker based understanding of the disease and the patient response into the clinical protocol, we were able to take what would have been a failed trial and move it into a successful trial. And now that therapeutic is moving towards the clinic. So, it's just and this is happening over and over again, where it's important to make the observation. It's important to characterize the patient sample, but then really understanding the why behind the patient response helps guide the entire pharmaceutical apparatus to make the changes in the protocol or in the therapeutic so you maximize that probability of success.
I just kind of think through the different companies that I've worked with, and I think you and I talked about this before, where we would get data sets where people would say this is going to be the end of the company. Hey, look, everybody, all the smart scientists essentially had looked at it, and then luckily there were people that knew hey, look, if we filter the data this way or we look at the data a bit differently, we can possibly work our way around this obstacle one way or the other. And the nice thing that I'm hearing as well in some of the solutions that Sapient provides is just this capability of, not just using what you currently have, but also having a data set, more or less that you can count on to help you through some of that struggle as well.
I mean, that's so true, Don. There's so much investment that's made in the preclinical context before therapy even enters into humans, before it gets into the clinic, that we really understand that therapy kind of chemically, what it does, and then what the safety profile of the molecule is. So once it makes it into the clinic, you don't do clinical testing on humans unless you're going after a very specific indication and you've defined that indication, that's the disease, and then you write that into the protocol. So when we talk about failed clinical trials, often it's not really the molecule that fails, it's the definition of the disease state that you're going after. So, you're working with something that you already know the safety and you already know the chemical activity, that sort of pharmaceutical activity of it. It's up to you as a pharmaceutical researcher and a development organization to define the disease so that therapeutic actually demonstrates efficacy. And so a lot of our work at Sapient is in working with companies to really understand how they should define the disease state, which sets up their therapeutic for maximum chance of success. It's also very good for drug rescue, where you have a failed trial. You've already invested quite a bit in the therapeutic and the molecule. and then redefining exactly what the disease is changes, a major profile, both for investors, but particularly for the patients that can benefit from that therapy.
Oh, so important. In terms of balancing your scientific and business aspects of your role, how do you make sure that there's alignment between those two areas?
Yeah, it's a great question because so many of the things we're doing are so exciting. And we observe things all the time that I think would have major impact in areas that are adjacent to pharmaceuticals. So things like diagnostics, things that would really help payers, that would work well for concierge medicine. Um, but we're entirely focused on pharma R&D. And so what I do in terms of bringing my scientific and business aspects together is bringing that knowledge of the pharma R&D process and then focusing like a laser on those areas where our proteomics data and our metabolomics data put together with genomics and transcriptomics, where those are really going to impact a pharmaceutical decision. Another thing that I really focus on is client traction, which means, it's great to have smart people in a room coming up with ideas to help pharmaceutical therapeutics advance. But what we really learn from is where pharmaceutical companies need our help. So that's what I call client traction. You put out ideas, the uses of the dynamic data set, as well as, our advances in our laboratory. And we see where we get client traction. We've gotten client traction, particularly in target identification, in translational medicine, the biomarker identification, and then accelerating clinical trials.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because my mind throughout this conversation has gone both to the diagnostics area, and just how much of this data and capability that you have at Sapient and how impactful that it could be for diagnostics companies as well. The second part that rang true to me in the conversation a couple of different times was just the ability to probably leverage a lot of this information back to, you've probably heard of this before in your life as well, but a lot of hospitals back whenever I was working in hospitals had tumor boards where all the physicians would get in a room and they would review cancer patients and the response that they were or weren't having. And since then, I know that there have been different projects to try and advance that capability. But, again, with a data set like you have, it sounds to me like it could be very impactful to that area as well. So, veering off the lane would be something that would be, tough for me as well. Just, looking at all of the ways that that your data set could impact, the broader world and treatment as well of cancer patients.
Yeah, Don, that's such a good point. The uses of real world data, and real world data is different than clinical trial data. There's really a parallel universe between what is going on in terms of regulatory submission to the FDA to get approval or to advance your therapeutic, and then what that therapeutic does in the real world when it's given in a bunch of different patient contexts with a bunch of other conditions, comorbidities, other therapeutics given at the same time. And so really sorting out that real world data, and I think the application of advanced analytics, whether AI or just good data organization, that's going to be transformational to how we treat disease.
Yeah, absolutely. Jonathan, what's the greatest piece of leadership advice you've ever received?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think a lot about how to help others to build their careers and how to put opportunities in front of people so that they're excited to come to work. So I think one of the best pieces of advice I've ever gotten was kind of a flippant comment from someone that was, what do you get from this place beyond just a paycheck? And it really stuck with me. And it's something that I've asked my colleagues and people I've supervised and mentored throughout the years. And here at Sapient, people hear it all the time is, great that you're here. I understand everyone works for money. it doesn't matter how rich you are, everyone values getting money. Everybody basically likes a paycheck and needs a paycheck. But what do you get out of your situation, either your job at Sapient or what you're doing, outside? What do you get beyond the paycheck? And I think it's a really good way to help people to articulate where they want to go in their career, what they want out of their day job that would give them better experiences for their next job or what they want to do in life. It can be really intimidating for people to sit down and let's have a mentor-mentee discussion. Where do you want to go in your career and things like that? So I find that simple question, what do you get from this place, or what do you want to get from this place outside of a paycheck, is a great way to catalyze that discussion.
So it is a very good question, because I see a lot of, especially, inside of smaller companies with scientists, especially because they're so passionate about the science just in general. And so, there's so many people that will just, grind away. And then the question, at the end of the day is, okay, so I understand you've gotten a paycheck, but other than that, what else did you get out of this experience that you're walking away with that, really benefits you? And it's funny because I've run into scientists, then, a few years later and ask them, so, tell me more about, what you took away and how did that influence your career? And it's funny because oftentimes these things are building blocks that you couldn't define the day of the experience, but later on, all of a sudden, recovering a drug, safety trial, or recovering a diagnostic from the brink of disaster, they've been enough down that path. They know, kind of, look, I'm not going to get worked up about the little things. Let's go focus on what we have to do to move things forward and get out of the situation that we're currently in.
Yeah, Don, that's so true. And I think that question, what do you get out of this place beyond a paycheck? It really works looking forward too. And for non-scientists as well, especially like, what do you want to get out of this place tomorrow beyond a paycheck? Really helps people to define what excites them about work. And I think it's a great way to stay inspired.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, what inspires you?
What I find really inspirational, this is actually I guess this is a piece of advice. Maybe I should have answered the other question that way, but I had a guy who trusted me a lot early on, a University of Pennsylvania professor named Greg Voth, who said, science is actually pretty easy. You only need one good idea. And that stuck with me a lot because it's true. In a lot of contexts, there are there's pressure to come up with so many ideas, and, problem solving is all about throwing a bunch of different ideas out there. But ultimately, the key unlock is just taking one good idea and driving it through. So the ability to focus, to recognize what a good idea is, and then focus on that, that's, I find, really inspiring. And so you don't have to constantly solve new challenges every day with a million ideas. You have to solve them with one good idea.
Yeah, it is. I kind of call it the entrepreneur's dilemma as well, because the one thing I've seen a lot of business leaders do is whenever things get tough, they come up with another business idea of something else they'd like to go off and solve. And rather than doing that, what I also hear in your answer is, hey, look, if you take the incremental idea and you continue to work those ideas, most likely you're not going to go off and create a bunch of other businesses. You're going to sort of stick with what you're focused on. And so that ultimately is important, big company or small. But yes, very inspirational too. What concerns you?
Wow. I'll tell you something that doesn't concern me, that people talk about a lot right now. And then I think it'll lead to something that does truly concern me. So what doesn't worry me is AI, and especially the aspect of these trained models. I fully believe that with AI, and sort of unsupervised machine learning, we're going to have problems in the future, right? Because you have problems with any technology. And, I think some of the challenges we'll face with AI, just as a human species, they're going to be catastrophic, but they're going to be there whether we had AI or not. So, issues of warfare, issues of scarce resources, issues of inequality, they're going to be caused by AI. They're going to also be addressed by AI, but those would be things that we have to wrestle with anyway. And I think we have had trained models that we didn't understand really throughout human history. I don't know how a dog thinks, but I do know that dogs have interacted with humans and learned things and know things. And my dog recognizes things in me that, you just don't know how they know. And obviously, a dog that sees you holding the leash and you have your jacket on, they know it's time for a walk. But then dogs and other species recognize and know things that we don't fully understand. I also think that evolution is essentially a trained model. What AI is doing, I think, is going to rapidly accelerate the kinds of things that you would learn through normal evolution. But overall, AI doesn't really worry me. What worries me about it, though, is I think that there is a generation of professionals that used to have opportunities for entry-level jobs. And those jobs, I think, are just fundamentally going away. And I think this was true of automation and manufacturing. And there are lots of examples throughout recent history of entry-level jobs going away or lower-level starter jobs going away and being replaced with other jobs. So I do think that there are opportunities for young people. But I really worry that people not having that first professional opportunity and the opportunity to go to an office or to a job site, be there on time, make a contribution, and do that from a young age is really challenging. I think it's something that worries me a lot for us as a civilization. Not kidding. I mean, I think that's going to be a problem.
Yes, in my long time on this earth as well, I mean, I've seen kind of the slow reaction to those sort of things as well, which, ties to the same concern, which is just that, rather than people preparing themselves for the fact that, hey, look, AI is coming, most likely it will take away whatever job that is out there. And rather than preparing for that and saying, hey, look, I'm going to go and enhance my skills so that it'll make it harder for this thing to catch up to me.
Yeah.
Instead, they just more or less sit idly by and let it pass by them, and then kind of expect the world to say, oh, we should turn off AI, which, oftentimes is not going to be the reaction. So if you're a realist, you kind of come back to this, well, okay, so what are you going to go do about it now that it has taken your job or, changed the way that maybe the world works?
Yes.
I saw something from Micah Kaufman last week, who's the CEO of Fiverr, where he said something about, to his employees that, look, AI is going to take a portion of your jobs away. And for those of you who aren't using AI to your advantage, you need to start quickly learning and figuring out how to do that. All of these low-level things that you've enjoyed sort of taking time, and, it's something that's a part of your job that's gone now. If I need, something to quickly tabulate data or whatever, I'm just going to turn to one of the local models and go get it done. I'm not going to come to you to do it anymore. So, and I thought it was a pretty open and honest conversation to have with, any team about, hey, look, the world is shifting. We may as well, kind of understand that and come along with it.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned skills. People often think skills are something that you can put on a CV, something like, I have skills in Excel, or I have skills with generative AI and know how to use that. I think of skills much more as the ability to show up every day, be presented with problems, solve those problems, and then move on to the next problem. And so that fundamental skill of not knowing how to approach something, and then by the end of the day or the end of the week or the end of the month, solving that and moving on to the next challenge, I think that's the fundamental skill that I'm talking about, that worries me that young people might not be hitting that in a professional context until much later in what would be a normal career, or maybe not at all, like because they're looking for a specific definition of a job.
Oh, so true. Last question. What excites you?
What excites me? I've always been a data scientist. I really believe in analytics. So I think what really excites me going back, for a while, is being the first person or being in a small group of people who see a data set for the first time. And, I just find that extremely exciting. One, that there could be a discovery in there that fundamentally no one has seen before, or it is just a view of the world. All data is just an observation. And so it's very cool to reflect on what could be a unique observation, just putting the data thing aside. So what excites me a lot is being in a small group or being the only person to have a perspective or see an observation and make some kind of sense of it. And that's what's really exciting about lab data generation, the proteomics that we do, and then the interpretation of that.
Yeah. Wow. Exciting for sure. And Jonathan, I wanted to thank you so much for being on the Life Science Success podcast and for telling us about Sapient and all the great work that you're doing there. I really appreciated you being on and hearing the story.
No, Don, it's a great podcast, and I really appreciate the chance to share these perspectives. And really great questions.
Thank you for listening to Life Science Success. For complete details about this podcast, including show notes, how to get in touch with guests, and more episodes, please visit www.lifesciencesuccess.com. If there's someone you'd like for us to invite to the show as a guest, please let me know by sending me a message at the podcast website. Please click subscribe on your favorite podcast app, share the podcast, or tell a friend about it. And last but not least, rate the podcast. Thank you again.